Welcome back to In-Depth Literature. Today we are here for Why You Should Read Devils by Fyodor Dostoevsky, aka Demons. Depending on the translation you have, it undergoes two different titles simultaneously, or separately rather. And this is one of Dostoevsky's most difficult, convoluted, meandering, socio-politically complex, religiously complicated works. And I definitely don't recommend starting with Demons, but once you've gotten your feet wet with several of Dostoevsky's smaller, earlier tomes, his short stories, his notes from the House of the Dead, etc., Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, this is a really good place to start. And we are continuing the Dostoevsky Project, reading all of Fyodor Dostoevsky's works in chronological order for the most part. So once we've made this analysis of Devils, we'll probably take a break from Devils and we will move on to Brothers Karamazov. We have read this tome back to back over the last 5 to 6 months, I would say, and definitely not an easy read. Very complicated socially, politically, historically, religiously, but there are some ways you can make approaching Dostoevsky's Devils a little bit more useful, a little bit more fruitful. So as we do on this channel, we're going to sort of take you through our annotations, and I'm going to try not to have my nose completely buried in the book because I want to talk about the major themes and the major motivations, socio-politically, religiously, that Dostoevsky had in order to give us this really convoluted, dark tome of socio-political espionage, nihilism, atheism, neo-Marxist liberalism, etc., that was sort of in direct conflict with Dostoevsky's sort of Russian Orthodox traditional Slavophile tendencies, where Dostoevsky, as opposed to sort of these new ideas like atheism, socialism, etc., Marxism, Dostoevsky was a staunch Slavophile, meaning he wanted to sort of preserve these anti-nihilist, anti-atheist, more original Russian Christian ideas that, yes, were sort of based in the political structures of having the czar and the serfs and the higher ups and the lesser type of people. But Dostoevsky was also sort of conflicted because he was an advocate for emancipation of the serfs and social equality rather, etc. Excuse me. But at the same time, on the same token, he was a staunch Slavophile. He wanted to sort of preserve the original Russian traditional identity, if that makes sense. And I will say that there's some other texts that will help you sort of contextualize the universe of Dostoevsky's Demons. A good example is like a really good biography like the one we have on the shelf right here, Joseph Frank's really massive Dostoevsky biography. And I will say that this gets into really overly specific territory of all the complex ins and outs and dialectics of Dostoevsky's socially political universe. And although those things are useful, they're important, I think it's good to really or at least have a brief understanding of who some of these characters are based off of in Dostoevsky's really complex tomes. And I knew that was going to happen because that book is really, really heavy. I don't know, I'm going to lean it up against the piece of wood there and we'll see if it actually stays. So anyway, those things are helpful. Also, books like Fathers and Sons by Turgenev, which we have started recently to further contextualize the Russian debate of nihilism, atheism versus traditional Slavophile Orthodox Russian values, if you will. This is probably something I should have read before reading Demons, but you can't read everything in order. But Dostoevsky was not only responding to his current socio-political religious universe, but he was also taking a stab at other writers such as Turgenev and sort of the up-and-coming nihilist slash atheist or writers that attempted to write about those themes, but in Dostoevsky's opinion, had not gone fully all the way into really taking a strong statement against nihilism, neo-Marxism, etc., socialism, atheism, and Dostoevsky was sort of demanding that his former writers that have come before him and also his contemporaries, that we must stand up against these hostile outside forces that are rotting away at the sort of Slavic Russian Orthodox identity, the traditional values that we have grown up with for centuries. We must rid ourselves of nihilism, atheism, neo-liberalist, socialist sort of ideas. But at the same point in time, as we stated at some point earlier in this video or in our previous other Dostoevsky videos, Dostoevsky had started out as more of a radical, like the characters that he's going to be exploring and critiquing in Devils. So it offers a little bit more validity or credence to Dostoevsky's critiques of his contemporaries socially, politically, morally, religiously, etc., because he had been through the whole gambit of, nihilism, radicalism, emancipation of the serfs, sort of anti-czarist, anti-Russian government ideas at this time, but he had sort of come full circle, and he was still an advocate for social equality and for, emancipation / freedom of the serfs, freedom of religion, etc., but he still held his prejudices. And if you have been following our Dostoevsky journey and our lectures that we've featured on Dostoevsky, you can see how being locked up in a prison camp in Siberia for being a radical sort of far leftist identity leaning person at that time, maybe even borderline nihilist, atheist, sort of social revolutionary, although he at that time believed that he was doing something productive and doing something to further the Russian cause or the Russian identity, socially, politically, morally, by the time he had gotten out of the prison camp, Dostoevsky had sort of shed these earlier radical, more liberal beliefs, we would suggest he had sort of come full circle and sort of found God again, found Jesus, what have you, and sort of found the value in associating himself, or at least grounding himself morally in some type of faith. Now, he wasn't like a worshiper of the Tsar or necessarily, worshiping the state of Russia on a sort of political loyalty level, like in that sense, but he was sort of advocating for these traditional Orthodox, non-atheist, non-socialist, non-modern, sort of proto-postmodern values that would not only infiltrate Russia, but also sort of, influence Europe and America as a whole. So Dostoevsky is wrestling with a lot of these things. There's parts of Dostoevsky's socio-political religious worldview that often are contradictory. He wants the best for everybody, but at the same time, he is sort of unwilling to compromise with these more radical groups that are coming up at that time. But it's so fascinating to understand all of those cultural and sort of socio-political movements, characters, people, etc. But you have to be able to that discernment on why these things are still valuable to read nowadays. Why are you reading Dostoevsky in the year 2026? And that is, so basically what I'm trying to say is, although it's good to have a sort of a strong knowledge base of Dostoevsky's current political, socio-political, religious climate, it's also important to understand how that is relevant to today. And I think reading Demons in particular, it reflects a lot of modern struggles that we're having now with radicalization on both sides, and Democrats, Republicans, socialists, nihilists, Orthodox versus Catholics, whatever the case may be, that there's always going to be sort of, there will always be political strife, sort of socio-political strife, disagreements, etc. But to what level are we to sort of allow these radical, on both sides, right, these radical ideas or motivations to influence not only our own personal lives, but sort of our religious legacy, or our socio-political legacy, rather. So I'm going to take you through, probably rather slowly. This is going to be more of a longer lecture today because it is such a mammoth, obese text. I mean, it is just literally insane. And we've just read it back to back, as we said recently. And just because I read it back to back and have read it and took annotations, that does not mean I'm far from, that does not mean that have completely mastered Dostoevsky's socio-political, religious, universe in Devils, but I would like to think that I'm fairly close on giving a sort of a cursory overview of it. So we have a lot of complicated characters, a lot of complicated situations, a lot of backdoor dealings, a lot of espionage, a lot of secret letters being written, as Dostoevsky loves to have his characters do. We have a lot of irony, perhaps. We have a lot of things, characters not always saying what they mean, but we also have, characters with a lot of baggage. I mean, that's going to be a typical thing in Dostoevsky's socio-political worldview. And we have some things that do not, we have a lot of loose threads in Devils / Demons that do not get sewn up until the very end. And Dostoevsky's sort of attempt to create this overly convoluted, complicated socio-political drama. It's also a satire as well, I forgot to mention, because he is making fun of his contemporaries. He's making fun of radical, nihilists, atheists, Marxists, etc. But it is sort of a comedy of errors, if you will, but it's also an extreme tragedy with a lot of violence, espionage, betrayal, etc. So although the novel is traumatic and convoluted and socio-politically complex and deranged, there's people with secret letters and people with paranoia and fevers and people getting humiliated, people getting unlived, people getting harassed, what have you, abused. It is sort of a mockery of Dostoevsky. Not that he's making a mockery out of these characters, but he's sort of saying that the sheer absurdity of these radical political movements and also the types of people that get involved in these radical political groups. And also, in addition to that, thirdly, the way that these radical ideologies influence these human beings is a form of ludicrous insanity. If it wasn't so absurd, it would be funny. That's kind of what Dostoevsky is suggesting to us. But sort of initially, the initial inspiration for Dostoevsky's Devil/Demons was a sort of convoluted murder case known as the Nakiev case. I'm probably not pronouncing that 100% perfectly, but Sergei Nakiev murders one of his fellow peers. They were going to this. They were these Russian, up and coming young Russian students that sort of dabbled in radical political ideologies. And this Sergei Nakiev actually ended up unliving another student named Ivanov, and Dostoevsky sort of closely studied this case and sort of closely studied the motivations, the court proceedings, what have you, and sort of started to germinate in his mind, writing this novel called Devils or Demons. Originally had a different title, I believe, but sort of this idea that was sort of branching off of Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, Notes from the House of the Dead, etc., but sort of putting all of Dostoevsky's political concerns, religious concerns, moral concerns, humanity concerns, with the serfs and separation of church and state and nihilism, atheism, etc., trying to sort of put them all into this ball of a novel, of a chaotic novel, if you will. But he's also sort of giving a nod to sort of his Christian faith, his faith in the Gospels, or his reverence, his belief, his knowledge of the Gospels, where we have that story from St. Luke, obviously, where the demons sort of are starting to accost Christ and Christ's, community at that time, and they're so afraid of Christ's goodness or his power, and Christ is so full of forgiveness that he sort of says, let the demons be cast out of you. Or I think maybe the demons sort of suggested that we are so afraid of you, you don't kill us, but sort of put us into the embodiment of these animals. And Christ sort of casts these demons into the bodies of these pigs, and then the pigs sort of obviously, or the swine rather, sort of run themselves into oblivion off the cliff. That's sort of a Spark Notes version of what actually occurs in that passage from the Bible. We can sort of see where Dostoevsky was using that as an allegorical motif of social corruption. Demons, that being the radical political ideologies of atheism, nihilism, neo-Marxism, etc., were sort of infiltrating these Russian people, this traditional Slavophilic Christian Orthodox universe, and Dostoevsky saw these outside forces as literal demons, not literal demons in the sense of like demons flying around with pitchforks, but sort of this political, socio-political cognitive dissonance that leads to a form of spiritual corruption/possession. So Dostoevsky is not necessarily performing an exorcism in his novel, right? He's not saying that because you do this and that, therefore you're a literal demon. But he's saying that these radical, political, religious, moral places that people end up going down, for better or worse, that causes a lot of social decay, and therefore their spirits, their sort of socio-political spirits have been hijacked by these intellectual demons that must be cast out. Sort of the further element to that, sort of the further critique that Dostoevsky suggests in the pages of Devil/Demons is that oftentimes these nihilistic, atheist, negative, dark characters are obviously they're carrying a lot of their own life's baggage with them that led them down these radical paths to begin with. But on the other side of the spectrum, they are also sort of naively fooled into going down these dark political corridors / paths where they would not have gone down that route if they had sort of had a stronger faith to begin with. So we can sort of see how that applies to modern senses of radicalization, etc. Sort of this critique that a well-rounded person would not be fooled by these radical political ideologies. And we can see that Dostoevsky is wrestling with these characters, but he's also wrestling with himself. He's sort of putting different aspects of himself, of his own contradictions, of different idiosyncrasies that he hasn't quite figured out himself, morally, mentally, spiritually, and emotionally. And he's sort of experimenting with those different conflicting parts of his personality in these different characters. But he's also critiquing, calling out evil when it's due. He's saying there is a moral standpoint or a moral compass, if you will, to sort of help us along our path to decipher good and evil, that it's not just good enough to sort of, like maybe his previous other novels, like Crime and Punishment, for example, were more morally ambiguous, perhaps, whereas Devils directly explores these dark these dark passages rather of human nature, and directly sort of shines the spotlight, God's spotlight, the light of Christ onto these dark characters and says, yes, this is morally wrong, this is morally evil, but he's also giving these characters the choice of free will that we all have throughout our lives. So Dostoevsky is not necessarily a religious radical or socio-political radical, but he is sort of pointing the finger, and in a similar vein that maybe Tolstoy would do, just not quite as preachy. He is sort of leaving open, not necessarily saying that these characters are, or he's not necessarily saying that the themes are morally ambiguous, but he's sort of suggesting that it's up to you to interpret these characters' motivations. Were they justified? Does their trauma justify their radicalization, perhaps, or vice versa? Does radicalization sort of, in fact, seek out broken people? And I think that's another really profound aspect to Dostoevsky's Devils. Now, just sort of briefly, the novel is split up into like 3 different parts. The beginning part documents the genesis, if you will, of these radical political groups. Now, right off the bat, considering the early section of the novel of Demons, and before I get into that, the novel is split up into 3 different parts, and the early part is sort of the genesis of how these characters and how these radical groups sort of came to be. The second part, it explores the embarrassment of some of these characters, the humiliation, the further espionage / betrayal that occurs at this sort of literary matinee that occurs in the second half of the novel. And by the time we get to the last part of the novel is really where these characters' motivations are really sort of exposed and sort of delved into. And that is where the characters' motivations sort of become clear from the early part of the novel to the horrendous things that will occur later on in the novel. And like I said, it's a very confusing, sort of overly complex, convoluted, deranged, typical. I would say it's probably Dostoevsky's most deranged novel, although we haven't read Brothers Karamazov yet. But I think Brothers Karamazov has more of a, from my understanding, more of a philosophical, religious catharsis, maybe, if you will, versus Demons, which is just complete chaos. Sort of, in terms of Dostoevsky's literary output, it's just one of the most darker, one of the more convoluted and difficult works to kind of wrestle with, because it is so heavily contingent upon Dostoevsky's current political climate. But it's also a fascinating read because we can sort of apply all of these ideas of radicalization, good and evil, social, moral corruption, and sort of how that affects our own modern times as well. So the early part of the novel sort of centers around Varvara Petrovna, her name is, and the Trofimovich family, which is Stepan and Peter, and they're like father and son. And Varvara Petrovna sort of serves as this den mother of radicalization, if you will. She's sort of cultivating these radical groups, these conversations, these secret meetings, these political pamphlets. And we get this idea that these characters are just very paranoid of each other. They have a few close constituents and friends and associations, but although they are desperate to sort of expand their radical political ideologies, they're extremely wary wary of everybody else that sort of comes and goes in this political climate. And there's sort of like an overbearing sexual Freudian tension between Varvara Petrovna and Stepan Trofimovich. She's sort of, they just have a strange relationship dynamic, and she sort of overly fosters his radical ideas. And Stepan Trofimovich is, he's on his path to radicalization, right? And has passions. He's a sort of former lecturer at a university, but he's been trying to climb the social, the social ladders, the social echelon, if you will, of his current academic, social, political, religious climate. But he's sort of come out as this fool. Nobody really particularly takes him seriously. So you can kind of understand from the get-go that all these characters are sort of desperately searching for some kind of socio-political moral identity. And early on in the early pages, we get these references and these explorations of sort of these basic socio-political conflicts that were going on, like Charles Fourier and sort of his utopian socialist ideas that were sort of starting to germinate in these young radical Russians, or alleged radical Russians, rather. And the early section of the novel also explores themes that you might have come across in Tolstoy's work, for example, or ideas that came along in the works of Ivan Turgenev and other Russian writers, proto-Dostoevsky style writers, proto-Tolstoy writers, even Gogol perhaps, that obviously we had these reoccurring themes of emancipation of the serfs, lessening the power of the Tsar, the Great Reform, things that help us get into the universe, the later socio-political, moral, religious universe of writers like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. Now, the whole sort of landscape of Russian political, socio-political, religious history is so complex. There's so many different eras, so many different conflicts and strifes and power structures, and you could go down various rabbit holes till the end of time doing that, but you want to sort of stay focused on sort of these characters' motivations, these characters' worldview, and how sort of the radicalization affects or doesn't affect the various motivation of these different characters. Now, as we stated, Varvara Petrovna is sort of the den mother, and she sort of starts to foster and germinate these radical political ideas. My annotation here says, Stepan Trofimovich morose paranoia, because he's paranoid of his own vanity, his own credentials, etc. He feels humiliated. But he also has this fear of irrelevance. But how that's related to Varvara Petrovna is that she sort of gives this man some false confidence, unquestionably worships his ideas, but she also sort of slights him in various ways. Like we said, she's sort of the cultivator of these political doctrines that are germinating in the minds of these young radicals. So we sort of get Dostoevsky's potential consensus that these characters are motivated by vanity, they're motivated by lack of self-confidence, they're motivated by sometimes even insanity, but they're also searching desperately for something to believe in. They're sort of searching desperately to use a political religious movement to boost their own egos, their own insecurities, and sort of to give their bad habits, their bad character traits, some form of validation. Now, although Varvara Petrovna is, we are told, this cultivator, this believer of new, up-and-coming, fresh socio-political values, she's also represents sort of this upper-class, out-of-touch Russian noblewoman, and sort of the society that she's created around her is not accurate. It's not a very specific, or basically what I'm trying to say is that Varvara Petrovna, from Dostoevsky's point of view, is sort of this out of touch, maybe what we would call now like sort of a blue-haired liberal Marxist white woman, if you will, sort of a woman that is, or a man, it could be either or gender-wise, but sort of a person that is trying to save the world politically, socially, morally, religiously, but not really recognizing her place in society, the influence that she's had, her potential privilege. And Dostoevsky is sort of critiquing these ideas of wealth and privilege and royalty versus non-royalty, but he's also sort of saying that these characters are oftentimes being led blindly down these roads, fighting for these political movements that they are just not either qualified or in touch with enough to really be able to identify or really to be able to serve. I think we see that now with people jumping on various political wagons when it really doesn't serve them either way to really fight for these causes that they believe are unjust. They need to focus on their own moral sort of spiritual universe instead of trying to sort of save everybody else's. And Varvara Petrovna and the Trofimovich family sort of orient themselves between Petersburg and this other smaller town called Skvoreshniki, I believe it's called, and they are sort of exiled or politically humiliated, socially humiliated from Skvoreshniki, and they are forced to sort of depart back to Petersburg, and that is where sort of the whole genesis of the socio-political espionage / corruption sort of comes in to the forefront of this novel, is really when all these characters start to meet and start to have these radical conversations / groups and start exchanging political pamphlets in and throughout Petersburg. One of my notes in the book right here says the battle between pseudo-intellectual conflicts. And I think we sort of explained that a little bit earlier, that these characters are just going down these socio-political rabbit holes, and that therefore they're all getting lost in sort of this underworld of things that are going on or perhaps not going on in sort of the social consciousness of these new radicals, but that they're so far removed in all these different radical rabbit holes underneath the ground that they are sort of, as a result, out of touch with sort of the political Russian Orthodox reality that's occurring, or they're out of touch with the real radicals because they have gone so far down the other opposite end and sort of become sort of pseudo radicals because their radicalization, if you will, has become so radical that they are unable to actually affect any meaningful change as a result of it. And I will say, for the record, it is extremely difficult to sort of pinpoint and get into the real specific, or sort of generalize, if you will, everything that Dostoevsky is trying to say, because there's so many complex philosophical, social, political, religious, moral statements that are occurring. But we can see here from one of my annotations, it says, Stepan Trofimovich's social circle discusses various social, political movements, state of Europe, Russia, etc. So it's not that they're existing in this Russian bubble only. This Russian situation, socio-politically, morally, and religiously, is being influenced by outside forces, but it also impacts whatever happens in Russia, has sort of a ripple effect onto the rest of the world or society, or so we are led to believe that these characters believe that. And similar to sort of in the vein of Tolstoy, Dostoevsky briefly explains this socio-political moral tension / fear that exists between the aristocracy, the czars, the upper class people, and the peasants. And there's almost this strange juxtaposition of this immense respect and willingness to sort of rescue the drowning serfs, politically, morally, spiritually, financially, but also this intense fear of them that someday the peasants themselves will sort of uprise and become more powerful than the very people that are trying to rescue them. So we can see how social justice always has sort of this downside to it, that there's always this fear of this lesser culture, this more struggling culture. Like, yes, we're trying to help them, but at the same time, in the back of our minds, we're kind of secretly hoping that these people that we're helping, these destitute individuals, peasants, slaves, what have you, are not going to sort of climb the social hierarchy and become more powerful or just as powerful as us. Now, whether or not we actually feel that way on a conscious level is debatable, but on a subconscious level, it's just sort of a social crutch. It's sort of a social ill or sort of a social fear that is just natural to human public discourse, or just it's sort of a natural process to human existence, is wanting to help other cultures, wanting to help your fellow man, but also kind of hoping that you can keep your place of sort of being in that position of power to help them. And you would not, although you're helping these destitute people, you would not ever want to necessarily be in their shoes. And of course, there's a lot of different ways you can sort of interpret that. Like, Tolstoy was willing to get in the trenches with the peasants to a certain degree, although he was kind of between two worlds, and although he renounced a lot of his possessions and his financial achievements, his writing, etc., he was still a man torn between two worlds. And I think Dostoevsky is suggesting that you don't have to be a man torn between two worlds. You just have to pick a idea and stand by it. That in itself is more honorable than going down all these radical rabbit holes. And sort of the ascension or the forgiveness or the accomplishments religiously of your own soul is somehow more important than getting distracted and sort of diluted by all these other social political ills and distractions that are happening. I think we can kind of relate to that. How do we improve society if in all these other things that we care about morally, mentally, spiritually, religiously, emotionally? How do we do that if we are sacrificing every aspect of our own spiritual solitude or our own spiritual, mental, social potential? The fact that we cannot help people if we are completely unable to help ourselves. Now, one of my early annotations here states that Dostoevsky sort of suggests that Russian liberal intellectuals are out of touch with the true Russian cultural identity. We can kind of see that because these new radicals, they are sort of trying to shed the skin of their upbringing. They're trying to shed the skin of Russian history. They're basically just trying to make something out of nothing, basically, and they are not really appreciating or taking into account the entire history, socially, politically, and morally and religiously of Russia, and how these ideas of Russian identity are integral to helping them sort of improve themselves. But they are basically sort of shitting and crapping on their homeland socially, politically, and morally, and they're basically saying that we want to burn this whole thing down and start fresh. And you can't really start a strong political movement out of nothing. And Dostoevsky is sort of arguing for us that these new radical ideas are not really based in any humanitarian historical background. They're not really based in any reality. They are just sort of emotionally driven conflicts, movements, motivations that sort of lead us down these radical rabbit holes that do not pay any homage to Russian history, Russian orthodoxy, and sort of these founding ideas of morality and good and evil that these people lack and that they need. Now, speaking of Varvara Petrovna, we cannot mention her without mentioning her sort of secret son. It's not really a full secret, but obviously Nikolai Vsevolodovich Stravogin is her sort of son, and she has a lot of sort of social, financial, marital motivations for her son, and she does not want him to be publicly humiliated. She does not want his dark secrets and his dark past to be left out. I'm not going to tell you everything that occurs, but there is sort of these weird financially, marital, sort of socially corrupt-driven love triangles that occur in a lot of these different families. But when we're speaking about a character like Stravogin, he sort of acts as one of the catalysts for exposing evil in the novel, or Dostoevsky uses Stravogin to sort of show us what a really corrupt, evil character is, but also the fact that he's sort of morally ambiguous, and we can sort of sympathize vaguely with Stravogin because he is in direct comparison to a lot of these other really radical characters that come up throughout the novel. So we get sort of a whole panorama of different aspects or different versions of what evil potentially can be or cannot be. Is evil more of a personal thing that we do unto others, or is evil sort of standing back but sort of maliciously, mentally, spiritually, socially, politically influencing others to do horrible things? Or is evil a direct result of nihilism, lack of faith? Is evil a direct result of atheism, a lack of faith? Or, how do these sort of things, speaking of nihilism versus atheism, is Dostoevsky sort of giving us the choice to sort of say, what is evil? What's more evil? Is it more evil to be a nihilist and sort of hate your own kind, hate humanity, hate social progress? Or is it worse to be an atheist and deny the existence of God and spiritual repose and spiritual enlightenment? So there's a lot of different conversations, if you will, that Dostoevsky is kind of forcing upon us and forcing us to wrestle with him along with the author and these characters throughout the pages of Devils. There's also a suggestion in Devils that Russian independence is important to Russian identity, Russian culture, Russian influence, and that although Russia can progress and take ideas from sort of these more modern radical ideas, there's this whole sector of society, Dostoevsky, the Slavophiles being one of them, that Russian identity does not need these more neo-progressive Enlightenment Marxist views or political statements or political ideologies rather to improve Russian culture, Russian identity, and Russian identity, history, theology, etc. has enough there already to improve the world, improve society, and that Russian identity is contingent upon holding on to that, not being transformed by all these outside sort of forces. And we see that going on now with the United States and other cultures being sort of resistant to sort of collaborating with other ideas and having other people from other cultures and stuff infiltrating their culture. And I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing. You can definitely see why Dostoevsky has these views. For better or worse, we could apply this to any concept socially, politically throughout the course of time and see that sometimes progress and diversity, etc., are not always the answer to having a better society morally, mentally, spiritually, etc. Now, as I said, there's a lot of complicated emotional connections, a lot of personal sabotage, a lot of different ways the relationship that these characters are interchangeably related or involved with each other. I'm not going to go down every single rabbit hole because it would turn into like a soap opera. As we said, this is sort of a comedy of errors, and it is sort of like a Shakespearean toxic drama with all these toxic, horrible relationships. But that sort of, although it loosely shows us the socio-political panoramic motivation of why these characters go down these radical thought processes or join these radical groups, it is almost like a subplot into itself. The novel is sort of split between the two different universes of the socio-political things that are going on, but also sort of the soap opera comedy of errors, relationship, toxic marriages, and relationship traumas that are going on simultaneously in under or sort of within the political universe. Now, sort of approaching a little bit further into the beginning of the novel here, Stepan Trofimovich sort of starts to become disillusioned / slighted by Varvara Petrovna. We can sort of see how these relationships are starting to crumble, and a lot of times these relationships are founded on radical political ideas and nothing really else. And the fact that these characters are all trying to one-up each other, they're all trying to be more radical, find more secret political pamphlets, they're trying to outdo each other, they're trying to show their loyalty to these radical groups, but outside of that sort of deranged dynamic of social exchange, social dialogue, these characters don't really have a lot else in common. Now, obviously, there's a lot of secret marriages being planned and sort of ulterior motives, secret motivations, familial espionage that occurs, and these characters are just chaotically sort of interacting with each other and sort of trying to get as much as they possibly can out of each other, but they're very self-motivated. There's not a lot of really caring, giving characters in this novel, I would say, although there are some. And as I said, a lot of these characters are sort of morally ambiguous, not to the point of like a Raskolnikov necessarily, but there's a lot of Raskolnikov-esque characters / motivations in this, and that Dostoevsky sort of leaves it up to the reader to determine whether these people are good or evil. Dostoevsky will show you how bad these people are, but he still doesn't necessarily tell you that these people are bad. So it's sort of a different sort of thing where like Tolstoy would sort of give you more of an essay preachy approach where he sort of leads you down a certain thought process or what he wants you to think, versus Dostoevsky, it's much more morally ambiguous. I think that's what makes Dostoevsky's novels so fascinating, is that we can see obviously that Dostoevsky was trying to expose human evil. He was trying to show goodness and evil and corruption in people, but he does it in such a very viscerally confrontational way because he doesn't really tell you what you're supposed to think. He kind of leaves it up to you. So that's just a really fascinating way to sort of approach the pages of Demons as well. Now, one of my annotations here says introducing another character named Laputin. You're probably familiar with him. And like I said, we've got a lot of different characters. We've been talking about them interchangeably, but this annotation here says Laputin as a potential spy, ? Because as we said, these characters are immensely paranoid of each other. They're backstabbers. They don't really trust that anybody is really taking the other person seriously. They are paranoid that everybody is sort of a political informant and they're all going to rush off to the czar and turn everybody in. And so there's this sort of hostility, this social paranoia / hostility that sort of further radicalizes these individuals and further radicalizes the public, because these radical ideologies, paranoia, espionage, etc., sort of causes this moral panic, this moral hysteria, if you will. Moving on a little bit further, Dostoevsky kind of brilliantly weaves these characters' former connections / histories / motivations, and sort of tells us where all these characters had been previously. What have they been up to all this time? How did they meet? How are they affiliated? So Dostoevsky also brilliantly does that. And as I stated, we're not going to get into all the idiosyncrasies and complicated character emotional dialectics of all these different characters, because we'd be here all day. I want to stay more focused on the overall social, political, religious, moral themes. I'll sort of piggyback off of some of those ideas that were sort of details that we discussed with some of these character motivations. There's a lot of different character arcs in this as well. We have the Trofimovich family, we have Varya Petrovna, we have Nikolai Stravogin, and we also have Labyatkin and his sister. And if you've actually ever read this novel, he's actually keeping a terrible secret that involves Stravogin, and Labyatkin is keeping this toxic secret going with his sister, and he mistreats his sister because there are some complications with her honor has been shamed, and there's a lot of secret marriages going on. We could see that you could really lose yourself in the personal lives of all these different characters. That could have almost been a separate novel in itself, more like maybe like a Crime and Punishment or Notes from the Underground-esque sort of novel or novella, and sort of the socio-political universe that exists outside of that could have almost been a separate novel in itself. I guess the reason we mentioned those two different parts of the novel, those two different spheres or sectors of the novel, is because it does make the novel kind of challenging, because we're constantly being juggled or juxtaposed between the political motivations, the social, political, moral, religious motivations, and also we're having to battle these personal struggles as well. So it makes the novel just a really long process. Now, fast forwarding a little bit further, involving nihilism, atheism, etc., we have this really complex, really profound part, this conversation between Krylov and the narrator. Again, with this book, we have an extremely unreliable narrator. He's kind of just this outside voice that is kind of gossiping in a way about all these different characters, and this novel kind of reads as sort of like a gossip expose or like a hidden diary exposing people. But it's interesting because the narrator is fairly objective, even though we can't necessarily trust him. But anyway, this idea of unliving ourselves in sort of the context of atheism and nihilism, and does faith interact with people on that level? Like, does a lack of faith cause nihilism? Does nihilism cause atheism? Vice versa. Does a religious faith, does that keep somebody a little more grounded than it would, an atheist, nihilist person who is just trying to radicalize everybody? And sort of this question that comes up that we are forced to ask ourselves: what is the value of religious, social patriotism or values or structure or heritage? How can we sort of embrace our, in this case, Russian Slavophile Orthodox values? How can we use that to sort of progress society, but not be pigeonholed into not being accepting of new ideas, etc. So, but going a little bit further, we have this idea of the new man, the new Russian man, who is sort of, Dostoevsky kind of poses this idea for us with this new idea of the new Russian man, who is sort of indifferent to death, embraces pain, becomes an atheist, nihilist, etc., and that through shedding his skin of any sort of moral compass, religiously, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, religiously, he is therefore immortal, because he is so uncorrupted by traditional religion, traditional values, and the fact that it gets into sort of these really complicated dialectics philosophically of, like, going beyond good and evil, but sort of the nature of life. Is there any such thing as morality? If you don't have God, can you be moral? If there is no God, can you overcome any sense of morality? So just very, very complicated conversations that Dostoevsky is forcing us to sort of embark on with him, morally, mentally, and spiritually. And a lot of these characters sort of have this toxic view of self-harming themselves, sort of this rapture through harming yourself or ending your own life. Therefore, you become God. And that sort of to Dostoevsky, and we can kind of see how it impacts the reader, that is the worst form of nihilism, or that is essentially nihilism, sort of believing in nothing, believing in your own destruction for sort of this pseudo rapture or false pseudo place that we feel we will get to by engaging in nothingness or sort of becoming nothingness as a result of our emotional, social, political, religious shortcomings, and that by shedding any sense of morality, therefore we can achieve some form of spiritual freedom, which really makes no sense. And that's why Dostoevsky sort of advocates for these old values that give us a purpose, religious orthodoxy, believing in something, cultural, keeping the Russian language, keeping the cultural Russian dichotomy of history and language and literature, and not being so influenced by these maybe more French or British or American values that are suggesting that everybody apply their views to socio-political, social justice or reform, what have you, to the rest of the world. So Dostoevsky is sort of like a proto anti-globalist maybe interpretation as well, and that what's good for one part of the country, what's good for one country or one society, one culture, what have you, is not necessarily good for the better of the world. Now, just jumping a little bit back to Shatov, he's another character that I don't think we've even mentioned. Like I said, so many different characters, but he is sort of orchestrating and is sort of blamed, and we are sort of led to believe that he's this conspirator of this secret printing press, and he is sort of the co-facilitator, if you will, of how these radical political pamphlets are being shared and distributed throughout this community in Petersburg, and therefore he is sort of demonized, and we'll maybe briefly touch upon what happens to some of these characters in the end, but we can see how although these characters are serving various political, socio-political, religious movements, they're sacrificing their own reputation to do so. People are wary of them. People are paranoid of them, and they are sort of being watched and stalked and blamed for influencing the very people that they are trying to sort of make an impact on. So going back a little bit to what we talked about earlier, there's really no trust with any of these characters. There's really no social bond other than this obviously radicalization and affiliation, but there's sort of this paranoia of who or what can we blame to get ourselves off, scot-free. We don't want the Tsar finding out about us. We don't want the Russian gulag or the Russian government to come after us for discussing and distributing these pamphlets. But having said that, we are willing to put ourselves in the fray, so to speak, to just have this sort of moral chaotic conversation or this sort of bloodbath morally, philosophically, at any cost, just to engage in sort of this radicalism that really gets nobody anywhere. And although we haven't fully explored the complicated universe of the different character arcs, motivations, emotional traumas, etc., we could sort of see how these characters behave at some point or another, comes back to haunt them and catches up with them. For example, the way that Peter Stepanovich, for example, calls out Labyakin's abuse of Maria and her relations with Stravogin. So sort of these complicated, ego-driven, trauma-driven love triangles / secret backdoor family dealings are like these characters think they are fooling somebody, they think they're accomplishing something or saving one person over another, but they're in fact just further entwining themselves in sort of this social chaos that ensues with all these different characters, and it sort of has a ripple effect and becomes sort of this huge, as we stated, soap opera comedy of errors, with all these characters not being able to escape their former motivations, their former lies. And Dostoevsky, that's another theme that comes up in this novel, is just the act of lying, how it sort of has the snowball effect and leaves us robbed of our honor and our own self-respect and our own dignity among ourselves and our peers, but that how our lies sort of similar to the way that the demons were cast into the pigs, from the Gospel of St. Luke in the Bible, that it sort of has lies in themselves, like demons, have this toxic sort of effect socially, politically, and morally to the universe of the characters and the political movements that are existing in this world. Now, there's this brilliant passage I wanted to share with you here where this literary radical matinee occurs. All these radicals of atheists, nihilists, etc., neoliberals, anti-czarist, pro emancipation of the serf type people have all gathered at this literary matinee, and they are sort of discussing critiquing the Enlightenment ideas of the French Revolution versus Slavophil ideas. And this annotation here says, easy to use the guillotine, but difficult to form ideas. And there's this critique of sort of using violence as, does using violence as a means for political reform, does that justify bringing on new ideologies, social progress, moral progress, etc., or does the sort of Enlightenment idea not hold up because they ended up using the same tactics of violence and espionage and suppression that their overlords had used and caused that revolution to begin with? So we can sort of see how all revolutions, all political motivations, all human nature as a whole always has a toxic aspect to it. There is really no way to sort of have a perfect ideal society. And I think that's partly why Dostoevsky is arguing for sometimes just leaving things the way they are, because change does not, like we stated earlier, does not always equal progress. And there's so many different details and ways to interpret social, political, moral, religious change, and that what's good for the one person is not necessarily always good for everybody else. Now, unfortunately, we start to learn that a character like Stravogin is actually a lot more despicable than we could have imagined. He is an abuser of certain people. I don't want to get into it for the sake of YouTube, but there's a lot of really disturbing things that Dostoevsky is exploring in here. There's chapters between, with Stravogin's confession, with he went to the monk Tikhon, I think his name is, that was originally suppressed and not published because it was so controversial. Like I said, not going to get into the details here, but I will say that themes of life, happiness, man's purpose, morality, unliving, I'll say physical abuse / I think you all know where I'm going with that. Actual abuse, I'll say, nihilism, etc., God versus atheism, human God, almost no separation between God and man. And that, for Dostoevsky, is another evil into this whole universe, is that there is no separation, there is no reverence, there is no acknowledgement, there is no respect overall, morally, religiously, politically, spiritually, mentally, of God versus man. That essentially I am God, or Dostoevsky is saying that is a character flaw to assume that I am God, I am more powerful than God, there's no morals, I create my own morals, I create my own society, I create my own blah, 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 blah. Sort of that becoming your own creator, your own self. It's sort of like not necessarily an anti Enlightenment idea, but and not that Dostoevsky was saying that there's no such thing as free agency or free will. No, Dostoevsky values those things very greatly, but at the same time, he's saying that you cannot have this narcissistic worldview of that you are basically God. And I think that's where we can kind of relate to that. At least I can relate to that in a modern context with all sort of the radical political ideas or motivations on both sides, whether it's Democrat, Republican, what have you, socialist, atheist, agnostic, whatever. But that the fact that is inherently the problem when you start to sort of self-worship and worship ideologies over God, morals, etc. Now, somewhere along the line, Shatov starts to grow very, very paranoid, not only because he is so involved with that secret printing press, but he knows that these other characters do not have his best interest. My annotation here says Shatov fears Stravogin will unlive him, accuses Shatov of still being involved with the radicals. So there's this constant social paranoia, this constant using people as political social pawns to get ahead. But when push comes to shove, these people will cut each other's throats to sort of escape punishment, escape responsibility, etc. Now, Dostoevsky does share with us briefly the history between Shatov and Stravogin and their friendship, and the fact that they traveled to America together and stuff. So we can sort of see why these different character motivations have become so complicated, because a lot of these characters have either grown apart or they've always secretly had ulterior motives. So now that push comes to shove, everything is kind of being exposed all at once. It's difficult to discuss Dostoevsky and some of these really large, complicated, convoluted socio-political works by him, because it's difficult to discuss those works by Dostoevsky without at least touching upon the Roman Catholicism debate versus traditional Russian Orthodoxy. And one of these characters says here, I think it's either Nikolai Vesselodovich or somebody, but he says, no, today's Slavophiles reject it, meaning, well, we'll get into that here, but nowadays people have become more intelligent, but you went even further. You believed that Roman Catholicism is no longer Christianity. So that's pretty strong statement there. He's basically attacking the ideas of Roman Catholicism and saying that they're not based in real traditional Orthodox values. Roman Catholicism is no longer Christianity. You maintain that Rome proclaimed a Christ who'd succumbed to the devil's third temptation, and having announced to the entire world that Christ cannot survive on earth without, I gotta pull my annotation here, rip my page in the process, earth without having an earthly kingdom. Catholicism had thereby proclaimed the Antichrist and had destroyed the whole Western world. Damn, Dostoevsky. It was you who pointed out that if France was in agony, it was solely the fault of Catholicism. For a while, it had rejected that stinking God of Rome. It had yet to find a new one. That's what you were able to say then. I remember our conversation. So they're bringing back all these old conversations that have happened, and these characters can, although they're sort of flirting and trying to hide behind these new ideas, their former statements are being brought up to the forefront to sort of add to the conversation, or to further sabotage them in the eyes of their socio-political peers. I'm not going to read all this here just for the sake of time and clarity, but as you can see from my annotations, you will be wrestling with devils/demons for many, many months, and if not years. I mean, you could really study this text throughout your whole life. We're only halfway through it here, but this idea of pseudoscience versus morality and Christian Orthodox values comes up. And it says here, reason and science have always, now and from the beginning of time, played only a secondary role, subordinate role in the life of nations. And so it will be until the end of time, he says. Nations are formed and moved by some other force that commands and dominates them, whose origin is unknown and inexplicable. This force is the force of an insatiable desire to go until the end, while at the same time denying that there is an end. It is the force of a continual and indefatigable affirmation of its own being and the denial of death. It's the spirit of life, rivers of living water, as the scriptures call, the drying up of which is threatened in Revelation. It's the aesthetic principle, as philosophers say, or the moral principle, as they call it. I refer to it more simply as the search for God. So obviously very, very complicated conversations that are occurring in this novel, and you will not be able to sort of rationalize or wrestle with it all at once, but we're going to move ahead here. Dostoevsky argues for this idea of cultural Russian Orthodox faith as a way to hold their place in the world's society or the world's chessboard. It says here, Russia as the true God-bearing nation, importance of a nation's faith. So Dostoevsky is arguing that though religion should not necessarily dictate every single thing on a socio-political level, it helps to have some kind of religious political identity. And I kind of agree with that. I think the radicalization is bred by a lack of purpose, a lack of faith, etc. And if we maybe had more of it's kind of an impossible utopian idea, but to have everybody kind of on the same page, morally, religious, and spiritually, what a great society that would be. But Dostoevsky is showing us that time demands the mechanisms of change, and that we cannot always hold on to those traditional values, although Dostoevsky tries to do that fairly desperately, but he's also open to change in the course of time. And sort of that whole section there kind of reminds me of sort of the Tolstoyan mechanisms of how a society operates on the sociological level, almost like these tectonic plates on sort of a spiritual level. They're constantly over time, over millennia, years, and cause and effect, and all these things are kind of slowly shifting and metamorphosizing cultural motivations, cultural change, etc. Now, we briefly touched upon Maria, and I forgot to mention that she sort of is a reference, or sort of functions as sort of a holy fool, a character that is beaten down emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, but she still has this goodness within her, this faith within her. She's been mistreated and abused, what have you. Whereas Stravogin, who is one of the instigators of that mistreatment and abuse, and also a bunch of other characters, but Stravogin sort of serves as the novel's antichrist. He's sort of the embodiment, perhaps, of those demons from the Gospel of St. Luke that have been cast out, of hell into the pigs, and that through Stravogin, although he's evil and he is the Antichrist, we can sort of have the approach of Jesus Christ, the mindset of Jesus Christ, and not to necessarily banish these characters to hell, but we can sort of further divert their evil into another place that potentially will not necessarily, give them punishment of eternal damnation forever, but sort of putting the demons like in the pigs to sort of give the demons another chance to sort of have free agency. Therefore, Christ is not necessarily the one sort of demonizing them. And I think we sort of get that idea that we are given the choice to sort of demonize people or give people another chance based on the beautiful art of free will. So Dostoevsky is kind of having this dialectic conversation of the importance of free will versus being diluted and controlled by these cultural radicalization concepts, and sort of acting on the basis of free will, how that serves us much better than sort of following a mob mentality, or vice versa. Dostoevsky doesn't always necessarily explicitly tell us what to do, but I say here, Shatov threatens the rise of the neo-socialist generation, but that this idea of sweating on, by the sweat of your brow and actually working and contributing to something equals a form of spiritual worship, a form of spiritual solace. Like I said here, my annotation here says work equals God, and we could give some credence to that by saying you're an atheist because you're a spoiled son of a gentleman, the last one there is. You've lost the distinction between good and evil because you no longer know your own people. A new generation is coming straight from the heart of the people, and you won't recognize it at all. Not you, nor the Verkhanevskys, father and son, nor I, because I too am a gentleman. I, the son of your serf and footman, Pasha. Listen, find God through work. That's the essence of it all, or else you'll vanish like a rotten mold. Find him through work. So whether or not he's kind of trolling, it sort of reminds me of Tolstoy's worldview of sort of the wandering, humble, holy peasant fool, perhaps, or the monk, like we just discussed Father Sergius and Kreutzer Sonata and the Devil and all these other sort of Tolstoyan Russian things, and that solace, having a purpose, having a job, or working for the collective betterment of a society is much better than sort of going at it alone down these radical rabbit holes, social or politically or spiritually. Now, the sheer preposterous, absurd radicalization of these characters comes up and is manifested in a character like Labiakin, for example, where he sort of recounts his free-thinking agenda upon his deathbed, and also suggests the idea of donating his flesh to the cause of these radical nihilist atheist ideas. And we can see how far the socio-political rabbit hole that these characters have gone, that they are willing to sort of sacrifice their entire legacy, their flesh, their blood, their intellect for these radical causes. And we can definitely see how it sort of on a biblical scale that these evil philosophies, how easily they can influence sort of social milieu or sort of social motivation, social purposes, and the way that we can either protect ourselves from that, aka like being a Russian Slavophile or like a traditional conservative, we might say, perhaps if you want to make that comparison. I'm not saying they're the same things. Or do we want to go down these more free-thinking, radical, sort of everything goes ideologies? What is sort of the antidote? What's the actual solution for these social, political, moral ills that we struggle with, whether we're in Russian Orthodox culture or modern American culture? And that is sort of what I'm trying to encourage people to think about through this lecture, is that although this novel is a little bit dated politically, religiously, morally, it's hard to relate to some of these things that these Russian people were going through today. There's a little bit of a language barrier. I don't live in Russia, yada, yada, but we can still see sort of the political implications, the moral implications of radicalization, atheism, sort of the nihilism, the different problems that arise from having too much diversity, perhaps too many different cultures, too many different faiths, all trying to sort of fight and vie for their own sort of place and influence in modern society. Now, sort of the subplot here continues with, Stravogin threatening to, what does it say here? Stravogin threatens and plans to reveal the secret marriage to Labyakin's sister, Maudya, in public. So a lot of these characters are sort of starting to shake in their boots for various different reasons. And like I said, you could almost read these interpersonal subplots as almost like a separate novel in and of themselves. We haven't touched too much on the idiosyncratic details of all these different character arcs and motivations, but they do influence the larger stage, these socio-political ins and outs and mechanisms that happen, and vice versa. So the novel is kind of split between keeping track of these socio-political motivations and also trying to keep track of the soap opera that exists with all these other characters as well. So it's a little bit of a tedious tome to get through for that, basic reason, but we're going to kind of keep going through our annotations here. In typical Russian fashion, of course, we have to have a duel, or Dostoevsky kind of flirts with the idea of a duel between of Stravogin and Granov, I believe. So, and basically Stravogin doesn't attempt to harm his opponent in the duel, but is sort of, offers credence, offers us a little sympathy to the character of Stravogin. Yes, he's evil, he's morally corrupt, but he's not necessarily willing to, hurt somebody else to sort of further his own socio-political goals, but he's sort of confronting death and sort of nonchalantly confronting death, and that very much disturbs his opponent. Now, further on, between father and son, between Stepan and Peter Trofimovich, their conflicts is also sort of explained, and it has fairly large implications to the overall plot as well. We also have some other references to von Lemke. He's another character that comes up, and his history and his intentions also sort of play a larger role in influencing the other aspects of these other characters culturally and socially and politically. And then the character von Lemke ends up writing sort of a socio-politically driven novel, but he's later mocked at the literary matinee and sort of humiliated, and that's where sort of the genesis or sort of the deconstruction of these radical political movements start to really begin, is in about the halfway point of the novel here, where they really everybody starts shaking in their boots, everybody's paranoid, everybody doesn't trust their constituent, their peer, and we can see how these, again, Dostoevsky is stating us for the record that radicalization leads to a complete derangement of the psyche, morally, mentally, and spiritually. Now, we briefly touched upon the secret letters that are exchanged, and we haven't really read any of them or specifically delved into them, but this one particular one here, a strange letter to von Lemke addressing the socio-political uprising, atheism, etc. So we can see how, and it's not necessarily fully explained even by the time we get to the end of this, but that there are secret letters being written that are often forged or falsely signed, falsely initialed, what have you, to sort of make the other characters look bad. But the implications of these secret letters or these socio-political pamphlets not only are they contributing to the overall moral panic within this sort of secret group, this secret society of radicals, atheists, socialists and nihilists, etc., but that these political pamphlets and these secret letters are basically just opening themselves up to being informed upon and further stalked by some of their enemies, and that these secret letters and secret pamphlets are not only fostering these new ideas, but they're also causing the moral decay of everybody else around them, because they cause paranoia, they cause radicalization, etc. Now, this idea of free will and becoming radicalized is explained really brilliant here with my next annotation here. It says socio-political brainwashing. Let me tell you something amusing. The first thing that impresses people is a uniform, and he's using this motif of a uniform to sort of say sort of a socio-political social uniform. He obviously, it's a literal uniform, but it's also sort of this idea or this critique of taking on the ideas of others in favor of your own. There's nothing more powerful. I've devised titles and duties. We have secretaries, secret emissaries, treasurers, chairmen, registrars, and their deputies. The next powerful force is, of course, sentimentality. In this country, socialism spreads chiefly as a result of sentimentality. You know, the trouble is second lieutenants who bite. Try as you may, you run up against them. Then there's the out-and-out swindlers, but they're not really such a bad lot. Sometimes it's even quite useful to have them around. Last of all, the most important force, the cement that holds everything else together, is their being ashamed to possess their own opinions. He goes on to say, now that's a real force, and who's worked so hard? Who's the dear man who has labored so diligently that not one single idea of their own has been left in their heads? They consider it a disgrace. So he's basically saying that these are the tools that these radical groups use to entrap and radicalize people, intellectually, and there's a lot of different forms of espionage and control. It's almost like a study of sort of socio-political radical intelligence. But obviously Dostoevsky had some knowledge of the military and the czarist regime and how these different groups on a sort of a larger scale socio-politically and the political powers could have their tentacles, what have you, in the minds morally, socially, and spiritually, but also that those very techniques of extremism, radicalization, espionage, control, and intelligence in general has this trickle-down effect into the lower echelons of society, and that the disenfranchised radical groups end up taking on the ideologies of their suppressors, if that makes sense. So it's sort of this cyclical, toxic cycle of radicalization and power and control that never really ends. And Dostoevsky advocates for the fact that traditional Orthodox Slavophile ideas can sort of help us overcome some of those inclinations to become radicalized, etc. Now, there's a really quick line here that sort of reemphasizes some of the themes we've been discussing, and this is a conversation, I think, between Madame Virginskaya and somebody else. But she says here, of course, the female student was not party to anything, but she had her own worries. She was intending to spend only a day or two in town and then travel through all the university towns to take part in the sufferings of impoverished students and rouse them to protest. She was carrying several hundred copies of a printed appeal, one she'd composed herself, apparently. It's curious, but the gymnasium student conceived a mortal hatred for her at first glance, although she had never seen her. So anyway, there's these young, up-and-coming sort of nihilist, atheist, socialist, neo-proto-Marxist students that are, in fact, doing that, just kind of like we see today in universities, just radical, mindless drones of radical people, oftentimes white suburban women just holding up signs, mindlessly protesting. And it's just like this zombified effect of radicalism. I mean, we can see how, the goose is not always good for the gander. And the fact that these people that are so far removed from these other groups that they're claiming to be a part of and protest for and sort of advocate for, sort of white knighting, if you will, they're so far removed by that culturally and cognitively and emotionally and spiritually, but there's this cognitive insanity or dissonance that makes them believe that they are fighting for this other cause that they believe is important, but in reality, they're kind of being laughed at because they are fighting for something that they are just not a part of. And how can you fight for something that you're just not a member of, or you don't have the experience? It just doesn't really make sense. Now, does it? And I don't want to start repeating myself because a lot of my annotations are very similar. God versus no God, immorality, nihilism. I think we've touched upon the major parts of this novel here, but I do want to take you through sort of our final annotations here. There are some attempts at social reform. There's this radical group ends up descending into violence, into chaos. And Dostoevsky also sort of poses this idea for us. My annotation here says violence versus propaganda. What is the better catalyst for change? And I think we see that today, and I think we see that the answer is that long-term indoctrination, radicalization, espionage, etc., is far more powerful than, like a Marxist Antifa protest, although that is a result of a long-term sort of mental, socio-political psychosis, thought control experiment as well, but that violence is more of a short-term solution for these larger endeavors and themes that these radicals want to sort of impose on people, and that the long-term sort of mental cognitive dissonance / influence is far more influential than just a violent protest, what have you. And then we have this idea, or this critique of despotism versus a mob rule. The Pope reigns over all, and the fact that the Orthodox culture does not espouse to the Pope. They reject the papacy, and for good reason, because a lot of these radical groups, although they are fighting for these radical ideas, they're from far other places where the papacy sort of has its tentacles in, morally, mentally, spiritually, financially in the community. And the fact that these people cannot really understand on a moral level what are the benefits, what are the downsides of true repression / control, because they're still worshiping Roman Catholicism, they're still worshiping czars, perhaps they're still worshiping leaders that sort of further design their own demise, but they're so blindly sort of worshiping these higher ups, perhaps like the Pope or somebody like that, or the Tsar, that they cannot really see the forest through the trees. And we discussed briefly the ideas of free will and making your own decisions, etc. And this concept, it disturbs Stravogin deeply. And when he goes to confront the monk Tikhon and sort of starts to confess all his earthly deviant sins, psychosexual sins to this monk, he also challenges the monk as sort of this holier than thou pseudo-intellectual sort of figure. My annotation here says Stravogin confronts monk Tikhon on his ulterior monkish motives, and that this idea of false piety, I've heard that a lot recently in sort of religious debates, but the idea of this horrible false piety is really not the basis for any kind of spiritual reform, spiritual ascension, because it is sort of this overly nurturing, overly pious, overly peaceful, overly pseudo-intellectual, pontificating perhaps solution to our real world problems. We've all known that overly pious priest perhaps that talks, that he wants to do everything good and save the world, but he's so far removed from these teachings that he is espousing because he's just overly pious and he has a lot of cognitive dissonance, ignorance, etc. Now, heading towards the bulk of the end of the novel here, I promise we are getting done here shortly. We have some violence, we have some unlivings, we have a big fire that takes place, we have all kinds of horrendous violence, we have mental illness, we have abuse on every shape, form of abuse you could possibly imagine. Dostoevsky did not shy away from the fact that there are radicals on the Slavophile side of the fence as well. My annotation here says riots, buffoonery, espionage, radicals on both sides, traditional versus westernized world. This is the current world. My annotation, or my note right there, says this is the current world, because this is in fact, although it's removed socially, political, and culturally perhaps because it's old 1800s Russia or whatever, it's not so unlike the current American political climate with radicals and Trumpers and anti-Trumpers and Marxists and neo-Marxists and feminists and pro-choicers and anti-abortioners, and we just sort of get lost in these overly convoluted, diluted dialectics socially, politically, that morally we just kind of socially and spiritually decay because we are just basically pawns in this socio-political game of intelligence to be used for the other powerful forces at will. And then some riots and radical fetes, radical socio-political pamphlets and fetes are being attended and announced, and political parties are sort of starting to turn against each other. Radicalization is further being exemplified in these characters. These characters are shaking in their boots, as we said, throughout the entire novel, but towards the end of it, they really start to lose their cool, and the whole group just kind of crumbles. And going back a little bit to the beginning with sort of the influences of Dostoevsky with the Nakayov case, with Sergei Nakayov murdering one of his fellow students, Ivanov, Dostoevsky was using that as a direct inspiration, among other inspirations too, to explore the evils of radicalization, to explore the corruption of trying to do too much too fast, being too young, being too cocksure, and not letting things germinate, not letting your life experience really germinate that wisdom, that necessary wisdom that we all need, versus just that youthful, impassioned political derangement that often leads us to passionate endeavors, but also can be very detrimental to our life socially, mentally, and spiritually. Dostoevsky goes on this really brilliant monologue here through the eyes of one of the characters, and it says, 20 years have passed since then. Universities have been opened and have multiplied. Military drill has been a thing of the past. We're short of thousands of army officers. Railways have been consumed all of our resources and have covered Russia like a spider's web. The result is that 15 years from now, perhaps, or may actually be able to get somewhere, bridges catch fire only occasionally, but towns burn down frequently in well-established order. In our courtrooms, we get judgments of Solomon, and while members of the jury take bribes simply in their struggle for existence, threatened as they are with starvation, serfs have been liberated and now flog each other with cudgels instead of being flogged by their former owners. Seas and oceans of vodka are consumed to support the budget, and Novgorod, right opposite the ancient and useless church of St. Sophia, they've triumphantly erecting an enormous bronze globe to commemorate 1,000 years of disorder and confusion. Europe frowns and once again begins to be restless. 15 years of reform. Meanwhile, even during its most grotesque periods of reform, Russia has never sunk so low. So he's basically saying that what's good for the goose is not really always good for the gander, and that diversity, progress, the papacy, Roman Catholicism, atheism, socialism, feminism, a lot of these ideas had not fully developed during this time. And Dostoevsky was not obviously an anti-social justice person or that ideology, but he was critiquing the alleged social progress or social justice motivations of some of these outside forces that really were not in tune, did not really respect Russian culture, Russian orthodoxy, Russian history, and just wanted to sort of impose their own radical neo-proto-enlightenment views on the Russian people. And the sort of the critique of this, not necessarily saying that the serfs should not have been freed, but that they don't have a leg to stand on. They're basically flogging each other and drinking themselves to death now. Moral corruption, and the fact that change, although sometimes it is extremely necessary, it does not always offer the miracles that it initially promised. And sort of by the time this novel ends, it ascends into this chaos of death and flames and sort of this literal inferno of these wooden apartment complexes and this whole business sector is burned to the ground. But this sort of obviously very physical, visceral fire that occurs and takes people's lives is a manifestation or sort of a social, political, spiritual allegory to the depths of hell that have basically, destroyed this radical secret society or this radical group. And that the fact that this society not only destroys itself from within, from its radicalization, its ignorance, its cognitive dissonance, but it also destroys every community around it or associated with it. We have another series of confessions and letters and initials that are sort of exposed, different character motivations. I could really go on and on and on. We're almost going on 2 hours here of the Devil lecture. There is a couple other things I wanted to describe here. And at the time Dostoevsky was writing this, he was suffering from epilepsy, debt. He was in the midst of the struggles of raising a newborn baby girl. He was kind of ostracized from a lot of his political literary peers. But Dostoevsky forged straight on and drove head into the depths of hell, literally, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, to write this novel. And it was also inspired by the Nakayov case that we discussed briefly, murdering the student, the up and coming radicals that were happening. But Dostoevsky, like he does so brilliantly with his other novels, is confronting aspects of himself that he's uncomfortable with too. And he's not leaving us with all the answers. He's basically just saying, this is what I think could happen, or this is what happens when ideas, radical ideas, sort of displace personal self-development, religion, motivation, solace, self-motivation, etc. Now, by the time we get to the end of Devils, I promise we are actually at the end, and I'll prove it by showing you only the final pages there. The novel sort of cyclically circles back to the redemption of Russia, to expel the swine, to expel the demons, and that orthodoxy and God are pretty much the only ways to sort of find that redemption. Yes, redemption is also a result of free will, making the right choices, but having sort of a social foundation in religion and culture helps to sort of nurture this collective well-being, or this collective identity, or this collective wish, rather, for the well-being of society, instead of this radical narcissistic void of atheism and radical political idea, etc. So we can definitely see what we can at least attempt to philosophize what Dostoevsky was trying to tell us here in these final pages. We have a lot of confessions where these characters, sort of start to let their guard down, or they jump off cliffs, or they die in fires, or they unlive themselves, they unlive each other. And we didn't really get into the specifics or plot-wise of what occurs, because that's kind of secondary to the overall themes that we have shared with you on this channel. Let me know what you think of Demons. To me, it was kind of definitely a more challenging, more sloggy, very convoluted, very tiring Dostoevsky novel, but I read it back to back twice. I really wanted to challenge myself. And like I said, we're definitely not a master of Devils yet, or Demons, but we have definitely gotten closer to understanding the ins and outs, the idiosyncrasies, the dialectics of Dostoevsky's complicated socio-political, religious, moral universe. And we will be continuing the Dostoevsky project, maybe not right away, but we're going to continue. Let me grab the books that we're going to feature over the next couple of months here. We've covered, the whole stack of Dostoevsky books right back there, if I can point to it right here. We've done most of those. Now we are going to move into, obviously, the Brothers Karamazov is up next. I've never read this. I'm really curious to see what it's all about. It's kind of the final installment of Dostoevsky's really long, overly convoluted socio-political religious tomes. But I definitely say that Devils, a lot of people, I've heard that people skipped over Devils. I'm not really sure why. You should definitely read Devils. But having said that, it takes a lot of time to really digest and to really understand. And up next, we still have yet to read Natochka Nezvoyanova. This is sort of a smaller, early, I think, prior to his exile in Siberia, perhaps. Dostoevsky wrote this. This is supposed to be an interesting, more traditionalist in the style of maybe Turgenev or Tolstoy, about Russian people or something. And then we have The Village of Stepanchikovo, which is sort of a discussion of serfs and lords or something to that effect. I can't really remember for sure what these are about. But we still have a lot of Dostoevsky kind of relatively to get through. We might even go back and analyze some of his older works that we've already done, because we have a much more detailed understanding of Dostoevsky now. And I will say that Joseph Frank's biography has been immensely influential and informative as well. Having said that, it's a little convoluted, it's a little specific, it's a little opinionated at times. And I think although it's good to read biographies and so on and so forth, it's also good to just form your own opinions based on your own life experience and your own current social, political, and moral, religious culture, what have you. I'm going to stop talking now. We will see everybody in the next video. Make sure you guys like and share and subscribe to this channel. Follow me on Instagram at Andrew Marlowe Artist, and please explore the Dostoevsky playlist and the other author playlists that we have so carefully curated over here for you at In-Depth Literature for you guys and gals. Thank you so much and happy reading. We will see you all next time.